Chapter 18 of Daniel Boone, Backwoodsman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kurt from Tucson, Arizona. Daniel Boone, Backwoodsman by C.H. Forbes-Lindsay. The Bloody Year. The winter of 1780 to 81 was long remembered in Kentucky as the hard winter. The intensity of the cold confined the Indians more closely than usual to their villages. But though the settlers were thus exempted from the annoyance of marauding parties, they suffered severely on account of the insufficiency of food. The crops of the previous autumn had been in large part destroyed, and many immigrants had arrived too late in the year to plow and sow. Buffalo meat and a scanty allowance of that formed the main subsistence of the people for several months. With the opening of spring, a number of Indian parties crossed into Kentucky. One of these ambushed a body of men under Colonel William Lynn and killed 4 of the number, including the leader. Captain Whitaker, with 15 guns, pursued the Indians and trailed them to the Ohio. Supposing them to have crossed the river, Whitaker commenced to embark his men in canoes with the object of following. Whilst thus engaged, the whites were suddenly attacked in the rear by the redskins, who, instead of taking to their canoes, had stepped into the water and walked some distance through it, returning finally to the bank, where they formed an ambuscade. It was a very pretty trap, and the whites were completely caught in it. 9 of their number fell in the course of a few minutes, but the remainder rallied and attacked the Indians with such spirit that they fled into the forest. In the next month, April, the settlers at Shelbyville, a station that had been established by Squire Boone, were warned by a scout of the approach of a strong body of redskins. There were few men in the place, and the stockade was not in a fit condition for defense. It was determined, therefore, to remove to a nearby settlement on Bear Creek. This proved to be an unfortunate step, for the Indians assailed the party en route, dispersing it and killing more than half its number. Colonel Floyd hastily collected 25 men and went in pursuit of this body of warriors, which numbered 200. Whilst they were fearless fighters, most of the leaders among the Kentucky settlers lacked the cool caution that characterized Boone's movements. Nor did they possess the intimate knowledge of the Indian's habits and strategy which enabled him so successfully to cope with the savages. Indeed, it may be said that the only military officer in Kentucky at that time who in any degree approached Boone in these respects was George Rogers Clark, and possibly Logan. As to the rest, they were constantly blundering into ambuscades that should have been avoided. In this occasion, Floyd allowed his zeal to outrun his discretion. In his eagerness to overtake the retreating warriors, he neglected the ordinary precaution of scouting across his front and marched his force into a carefully prepared ambush. Half his men were slain in the fight that ensued, and the remainder retreated in the usual disorderly fashion. Floyd's horse had been shot under him, and he was wounded. Weak and exhausted, he began to lag behind and would most assuredly have fallen into the hands of the pursuers had not Captain Wells, who was well mounted, come to his aid. Wells insisted upon Floyd taking his place in the saddle, and himself ran alongside, holding a stirrup. Thus both escaped from a very perilous situation. A feeling of enmity had existed between these two, but this gallant action of Captain Wells knit them in a close friendship that lasted through life. Among the most noted of the Kentucky backwoodsmen were 3 brothers named Samuel, James, and Robert McAfee, who had planted a station in the vicinity of Harrodsburg. One day in May, Samuel McAfee left the fort with another man to visit a nearby farm. They had not proceeded more than a quarter of a mile when they were fired upon, and McAfee's companion fell dead. McAfee turned and ran towards the fort, but an Indian sprang into the path to intercept him. The two men raised their rifles with muzzles almost touching. They pressed the trigger at the same instant. The redskin's gun missed fire, whilst McAfee sent the bullet home. As Samuel McAfee started afresh for the shelter of the stockade, his two brothers ran out to meet him. Despite the warnings of the elder, Robert insisted upon going forward to secure the scalp of the dead Indian. By this time, a number of warriors had placed themselves between the brothers and the fort. Samuel sped on, and although many shots were fired at him, reached the gate untouched. Dodging from tree to tree and using his rifle when occasion offered, Robert McAfee gradually gained to within 100 yards of the fort, when he made a dash for it and entered the stockade in safety. Meantime, James was in a situation of extreme peril. 5 warriors confronted him. He ran to a large tree for protection, but immediately afterwards 3 Indians shot at him from behind, making the bark fly near his head. He sought a new retreat, but with similar result. Finding that he was surrounded by the savages and could not secure effective cover, he determined to run the gauntlet of their fusillade. Accordingly, he set out for the fort with all the speed he could command, and like his brothers, arrived unhurt. The Indians now attacked the stockade, which was but poorly garrisoned. A hot fight was maintained for more than 2 hours, the men being aided in the defense by the women, some of whom stood to portholes whilst others loaded spare rifles. Warned by their scouts that reinforcements were on the way, the Indians abandoned the attack and retreated. Hardly had the redskins disappeared from before McAfee's than Major McGarry arrived with 40 men from neighboring stations. They immediately took up the pursuit and came in contact with the enemy before they had covered 2 miles. McGarry's men, who had been joined by the McAfees and others, made a vigorous attack before which the savages fled. They were pursued for several miles and completely routed with heavy loss. Aptly has 1782 been termed the bloody year of Kentucky's history. It witnessed the most terrible disasters that ever befell the settlers on the dark and bloody ground. We shall come presently to an account of the disastrous Battle of the Blue Licks, but will first describe 2 affairs that happened in the same year. The annihilation of Captain Lawfrey's expedition was the more serious, though the less interesting of these. Lawfrey was coming down the Ohio with a force of 107 men designed to reinforce the Kentuckians. At a point near the mouth of the Miami, he was attacked by a large body of Indians, and his entire party was killed or captured. It is a remarkable fact that when the whites and redskins were pitted against each other in large bodies, the latter were generally victorious. The backwoodsman always gave the best account of himself when alone, or when acting with 1 or 2 companions. A few men of the stamp of Boone and Kenton could withstand 5 times their number of savages. Thus it was that the Indians held rather a contemptuous estimate of the whites in general, and had, by contrast, an exaggerated opinion of the prowess of Boone and a few others. In May, Estill's station was attacked by a party of Wyandots. After killing one of the settlers and securing a prisoner, they slaughtered the cattle in the neighboring fields and retreated. Captain Estill assembled 25 men and went in pursuit of the Indians. They had crossed the Licking and entered a narrow valley. He overtook them as they were about to leave it. As soon as the Indians perceived the whites, they halted and took up position under cover to await them. The Wyandots were distinguished for bravery above all the tribes in that part of the country. They were rendered especially formidable adversaries from the fact that they would maintain a stand under heavy loss, which none of the other tribes would do. The Shawnees, Mingoes, and other savages with whom the Kentuckians came in contact invariably retreated upon the loss of a few of their number. This was not the result of cowardice, but of calculation. They justly reasoned that their warriors were so few as compared with the whites that a victory might easily be too dearly bought at the expense of 10 or 20 of them. The Wyandots, however, would sometimes lose half their number engaged and still continue the fight. Estill advanced his men to within 80 yards of the Indians, who had each taken shelter behind a tree and made a similar disposition of them. The Indians slightly outnumbered their adversaries and had somewhat the advantage of position. They also excelled in the matter of taking cover, but were inferior to the backwoodsmen in marksmanship. At the outset, the whites gained an advantage by wounding the chief of the Wyandots. Seeing him fall, his men began to waver, but he was almost instantly upon his feet again, and supporting himself against the trunk of a tree, he continued to encourage the warriors. The combat was carried on for upwards of an hour, with the utmost determination on both sides. The whites had lost 6 or 7 men, and several more were wounded, the casualties among the Indians being about the same. But there was no sign of giving way in their ranks, and Captain Estill began to be impatient to bring the affair to an issue. Considering how closely contested had been the fight, it is difficult to understand how Estill could have entertained the idea of weakening his line. He did, however, decide to detach 6 men and an officer in a flanking movement. The party was placed in charge of Lieutenant Miller, who was instructed to steal round under cover and take the enemy in flank or rear. Estill now faced the Indians with only 12 men, 4 of whom were wounded. His weakened condition became apparent to the enemy before Miller had time to execute his movement. Urged on by their chief, the Wyandots rushed upon the whites and forced them to retreat. Pursuing closely, the savages killed 8 of the backwoodsmen, and among them Captain Estill. Of Miller's party, but 2 escaped, including that officer, who was afterwards accused of failure to carry out his instructions. Whether or not Miller was remiss in his duty, Estill cannot be relieved of the prime responsibility for the disaster. The Indians were reported to have lost 13 of their number. Shawnees would have retired after 3 or 4 men had fallen. The marked increase of immigration during the 2 years preceding this time had wrought the Indians up to a high pitch of resentment. Despite their successes, they saw that the whites were able to oppose fresh men to them without apparent abatement of numbers. They realized that unless the Long Knives were speedily driven from Kentucky, they would become rooted to the soil. During the winter of 1782, the chiefs of the northwestern tribes held many councils and debated upon a concerted invasion of Kentucky. They made the usual appeal to the authorities at Detroit, but on this occasion found them unwontedly lukewarm. The surrender of Cornwallis in the previous October had taken the heart out of the British in Canada, and they were more disposed to think of defense than to consider aggression. 2 white men had great influence in the councils of the Indians. These were Alexander McKee and Simon Girty. The former was a British agent among the tribes who had gained an unenviable notoriety for the atrocities committed with his sanction, if not actually at his instigation. Doubtless the backwoodsmen of Kentucky, who execrated his name, exaggerated McKee's villainy, but enough is known on good authority to stamp him as one of the most cruel and hardened wretches of his time. Simon Girty was one of 4 brothers who were natives of Pennsylvania. Whilst they were children, their father was slain by Indians. The mother remarried, and soon afterwards the entire family was captured by the Redskins, who burnt the stepfather in the presence of his wife and her children. The women and the boys were then sent to different towns of the northwestern Indians. After many years' captivity, they all secured their freedom. Simon, as has been said elsewhere, served as a soldier and scout in Dunmore's War, but association with the whites was irksome to the man, who was by taste, habits, and education a redskin. He soon returned to the Indians and was readily admitted to a position of leadership among them. Girty acknowledged allegiance to the British, and although he held no official position under the Crown, had the protection and countenance of the authorities in Canada, and was permitted to establish a trading post in the territory. He was a close companion and confidant of McKee. In fact, they were kindred spirits, and it would be difficult to say which was the greater scoundrel or the more inhuman monster. Girty had all the ferocity and bloodthirstiness of the worst Indians. He delighted in their most refined cruelties and looked on with glee whilst helpless white women and children were put to the torture, or butchered in cold blood. He excited the passions of the savages and urged them to deeds of violence and barbarism. He frequently led them in their attacks upon the settlements, and many of the most successful expeditions were of his planning. Of such an evil and malignant disposition was this man that it is difficult to understand his interposition in the case of Kenton. Of the much that is recorded and rumored of Girty, this is the solitary act that redounds to his credit. He does not appear to have the redeeming quality of courage, but found a substitute for it in cunning and treachery. Under the advice of McKee and Girty, the Indians formed a plan for attacking the Kentucky settlements. In the summer of 1782, 500 warriors of the Shawnees, Wyandots, Miamis, and other tribes assembled at Chillicothe, prepared to march under the guidance of the renegade and his friend, the British agent. End of Chapter 18.